Hello everyone, and welcome to our 12th lecture in our course on general psychology. And this lecture begins a new unit, a unit on memory. So last time we were talking about learning, which is a very related process. It's hard to think about one without thinking about the other. But we talked about classical conditioning, operant conditioning, observational learning. And so now we're going to talk about memory, which, as we'll see, is more about how information is acquired and stored, uh, as opposed to a focus on behavior, which is what we had with learning. So for memory, uh, we're going to first ask, what is memory? How is it different from learning, for example? And as we'll see, there are different kinds of memory. There are also different processes that memory uses. We tend to think of memory as one sort of unified concept or one kind of unified function, but it has different components to it. And these components differ in terms of what stage of memory we're talking about, and we'll get to that, but also in what sort of information is being stored. And so there are different kinds of memory for different kinds of information. The sort of memory you use to remember your last birthday is different from what you use to remember how to drive a car, for example. We'll also go back and talk about the brain, both on a large scale and a small scale. So differences in memory, the different kinds of memory rely on different parts of the brain. And so you can, if you have an injury, lose one kind of memory without losing another. So what we're going to do is talk about these processes that underlie memory. Again, memory is not just a single function. It has multiple components, and they all have to be working in order for our memory to function. We'll see how memories are stored in terms of timing, in terms of content, in terms of reliability. And we'll talk about where memories are stored in a certain sense. At the small scale, we'll talk about how individual neurons, we think, store information. And we'll talk about some of the structures that are critical for certain kinds of memory. I don't want to oversell it and say that we know where in the brain all different kinds of memories are stored, but certain parts of the brain do seem to be critical. And we'll also see why some kinds of information are easier to recall. It depends on what you were doing at the time you learned it. It depends on the kind of information and how it relates to the question being asked, for example. But certainly, some information is easier to recall than other kinds. So first, of course, we have to ask what memory is. And simply put, memory is the ability to store and retrieve information over time. So there's this time component. Last time when we were talking about learning, there was also this idea of time, that learning required sort of relatively permanent change. And here we can talk about memory and we can talk about learning. And learning was very behavior focused. We talked about the acquisition of new skills, new knowledge, new behaviors that were relatively permanent, and perhaps most importantly, were reflected in behavior over time. So if we're changing behavior over time, we need to store information. So learning requires memory. Now, not all memory is evidenced. So that is to say that we can acquire information that we don't actually use, that doesn't change our behavior. So you can have information that requires memory, but may not actually reflect learning because you don't use it to change behavior. And so the distinction here is subtle, but learning is more focused on behavior, whereas memory is more focused on information and how the information is stored. And when it comes to memory, there are three key functions or processes that memory requires if it's going to be intact. So encoding, and we'll talk about each of these during the course of this lecture. This lecture is really about these three functions. So encoding is how we get information from the world into a form that can be stored. So that's why it's called encoding. You're sort of using a code or some sort of neural process that converts the information from its original form to something that the brain can store, that can last for a long time. You have the storage itself. So once you've encoded the information, once it's ready for storage, you then actually have to store it. And storage requires a physical medium, the brain, and the neurons in the brain. So we'll talk about how different kinds of information is stored, where we think different kinds of information are stored, what storage requires, what are the neural processes for storing information, how does that work? And then finally, we'll talk about retrieval. And retrieval is how we get the information back again. So if we encoded information and stored it, but we could never retrieve it, it wouldn't really do us much good. We could store a bunch of information, but then never access it again. We could never use it to our advantage again. And so retrieval is a really important process. And when we think about memory, again, we often think of it as a single function. But we can lose any one of these functions without losing the others. So you can lose the ability to store memories, but still retain the ability to retrieve them, and vice versa. And it's tempting, of course, to think of memory as a record of information, and it is. But we should avoid the idea that memory is sort of like a computer hard drive or a videotape, that it's a perfect record of what happened, and that all information should be accessible. So it is not a perfect record. Memory can change over time. It can become inaccurate. Maybe some things get stored and some things don't. Or maybe we can retrieve information in some cases and not others. We've all experienced that tip of the tongue phenomenon where we feel like the information is right there at our fingertips, but we just can't access it. We can't remember what we want to remember. Or we remember something, and then later it turns out that our memory of it was inaccurate. And there are a number of reasons that can happen. Or we think that something is really important. We want to try and remember to do something. And then at the end of the day, we've forgotten to do it. So these are all errors that we make. So memory is not a perfect record. And we'll actually save most of that topic for the second lecture of this unit, which your book calls The 7 Sins of Memory. So in this unit, we'll talk about these three processes: encoding, storage, and retrieval. And then next time, we'll talk about all the ways in which memory is imperfect. So we'll start with encoding. And encoding is the process of turning perception, thoughts, feelings into enduring memories, or at least into something that can be turned into permanent memories. So perception, that is information we interpret coming from our senses; thoughts, our own internal cognitive processes; and feelings, our emotions. These are all different kinds of information that we can store for later use. But encoding is that first step. We have to get that information from the environment or from our own psychological processes into some form that can be stored. And there are different forms of encoding that depend on the kind of information that we're presented with. And here we're going to focus on information from the outside world, not so much our own thoughts and feelings. So there's semantic encoding. And semantic here, and this word will crop up again and again, semantic has to do with meaning. So when you have a semantic debate, you're debating over the meaning of words or phrases, for example. So semantic encoding is when we witness a stimulus and we interpret it. We have to determine its significance, what it means. And this is most obvious when it comes to words. So words, of course, are composed of letters. But when we remember words, if we see a set of words in a sentence, for example, what we often remember is not the physical arrangement of the characters, The font, the weight of the font, the contrast of the letters, these are not the things we tend to remember when we're reading a sentence. We tend to remember the meaning. And so that requires semantic encoding, not the visual properties of the words, but their significance, what they symbolize. And that semantic encoding seems to require a particular part of the brain. In this case, the lower left portion of the frontal lobe. And so we can see that highlighted here on the right, where that underside of the frontal lobe is color-coded to indicate that it's important for semantic encoding. There's also visual imagery encoding. And this is not looking at meaning. This form of encoding does look at the visual properties of a stimulus. So here on the right, we see a symbol or a set of symbols, and people can remember what they saw, of course. And this is a simple stimulus. You can remember far more complex things than that. But visual imagery, of course, emphasizes the appearance of a stimulus, not its meaning, like in semantic encoding, but how it looks. And so you can remember visual details of a stimulus. And not surprisingly, this process takes a certain part of the brain, and that's the occipital lobe, where your visual cortex is. So visual imagery requires the visual cortex. Not a big surprise. There's also organizational encoding. And this is about relationships, usually between different stimuli. So you can categorize a group of stimuli and remember it that way. And this can often be a good memory aid. Rather than trying to remember a bunch of different words, if you memorize their relationships, you encode their relationships, it becomes easier later on to store and retrieve that information. And so by putting things into categories, or by concentrating on the relationship between words, and that's related certainly to semantic encoding. But again, this deals more with multiple stimuli, and how do we memorize the relationships between stimuli as opposed to the meaning of individual stimuli. And organizational encoding seems to require the frontal lobe, as does semantic encoding. But this time, it is the upper portion of the frontal lobe. And so we see slightly different parts of the brain required for these different forms of encoding. What's also interesting is that there's sort of an outside source of importance for remembering things. And that is to say that if remembering something is important for your survival, you tend to remember it more easily than something that isn't. And there's some question as to why that is. Is it really that our brains evolved to discriminate between stimuli that are important for survival and those that aren't? Or is it that stimuli that are important for survival tend to involve planning? So if you're looking at a list of items, trying to figure out what you would need on a camping trip, or if you were stranded on a desert island, the items that you need for survival, you're more likely to think about what you would use that item for. What would you need to do first in order to use that item? What other items might you need? And so it requires more processing. And perhaps it's that additional processing and planning that helps you remember it because it stays in mind longer, because you're concentrating on it more, rather than the irrelevant items, which aren't important for survival, but also you're not thinking about how you would plan to use that item. And so that's sort of an open question, whether it's really the survival value or whether it's the planning that survival requires that really boosts those items for memory. So that's encoding. That's how we get the information into a form that we can then store for later. And that brings us to actual storage. And what storage is maintaining information over time. And that's a fairly intuitive notion. We have to keep that information around. We have to put it somewhere so we can get it later. And there are different forms of storage, and one of the most important distinctions in these different forms of storage is how long they last. So for example, sensory storage, it only holds information for a few seconds and maybe even less than that. So that is not a form of storage that you use to remember for later. This is just residual activity in your sensory systems, particularly your visual system and your auditory system. So you have what are called iconic and echoic memory. Iconic memory is that very short-term store in your visual system, and echoic memory, you can see the word echo in there. Echoic memory is the short-term storage in your auditory system. So over here on the right, we see a grid of letters. And if this grid were flashed very quickly, you would still have a very short, but nevertheless, a memory of those sensory stimuli. So they're not totally gone, even if the stimulus is flashed very briefly. Your senses still have some residual activity. So you still have access to that information for a very short while, but for a little while nonetheless. So iconic memory corresponds to vision. Echoic memory corresponds to the auditory system. Short-term memory lasts a little bit longer than sensory storage does. So short-term memory is non-sensory. It does not depend on any particular sensory system. And this is, again, after encoding happens, to where now this information can be moved around, it can be manipulated, it can be stored. Now, short-term memory is just what it sounds like. It is short-term. It lasts less than a minute. In fact, studies suggest that it lasts perhaps up to 20 seconds. Now, there are different components to short-term memory, and there are different strategies for maintaining things in short-term memory for longer. If you're thinking about something, you can obviously keep it in mind longer than those 20 seconds. And so there's the process of what's called rehearsal. And what rehearsal is repeating the information to yourself so that it resides in short-term memory. So you're sort of taking it out and putting it back in short-term memory every time you repeat it. Now, if you don't rehearse it, now that information is going to be lost after those 20 seconds or so. But if you rehearse it to yourself, then you can keep it around for longer. Then, of course, there's the question of how much you can keep in short-term memory. And the answer is not a lot. We remember a few lectures ago talking about Miller and his work on how much information we can keep in mind. And we've heard that rule of 7 plus or minus 2, which is to say that you can keep 7 items in mind in your short-term memory, give or take a couple, but think about numbers. Phone numbers, for example, well, now we have 10-digit dialing a lot of the time, but a lot of phone numbers you think of just 7 digits. And 7 digits are those 7 items. Now, maybe you can remember a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, but 7 items is sort of the rule. But there's another strategy called chunking. And what chunking is, sort of a clumsy term, but it's very useful. When you group the information, it allows you to remember more. So, for example, if you have that phone number, if it's 10 digits, well, that's a lot to remember. Certainly more than the 7 that's our rule of thumb. But it turns out that an area code you might chunk as sort of one item, especially if there are only a couple of area codes that you ever need to remember. It's not really that you memorize those 3 digits. It's that you remember the area code as a single item. And so looking at numbers or looking at visual content, if we sort of group it together, then we can pack more into short-term memory because we've grouped the items into 7 or so chunks. And so that's another strategy for putting more into short-term memory. So we can keep information longer, and we can fit more in by using the strategies of rehearsal and chunking. Because short-term memory lasts less than a minute, there's an interesting phenomenon called the serial position effect. And this is if you're given a list of items, whether it's letters or numbers or words. If you're given that list, and then the list is taken away, if the items were read one at a time, or if they were presented on a screen one at a time. Later on, after they're gone, if you're asked which things do you remember, you're far more likely to recall the first items on the list and the last items on the list. That is, their position in the list, their serial position, makes a difference. So you tend not to remember those middle items so well. And there are two reasons for that. The reason you remember the most recent items, and this is often called the recency effect, is that they're still in your short-term memory. Now, again, you have to ask what you remember pretty quickly after seeing the list for this effect to last. If you wait too long, well, those items are out of short-term memory, and you don't remember the last items any better than the ones in the middle. So that accounts for the last part of the serial position effect, that you remember those recent items because they're still in short-term memory. The reason you remember the early items is because those items have already had a chance to make it into long-term memory, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the serial position effect is this phenomenon by which early items and late items are remembered the best. You also have working memory, which, depending on who you ask, is similar to short-term memory. Some people think it's the same thing. Some people say it's a totally separate system. But what working memory is the part of your memory that allows you to maintain and manipulate information. So, for example, if you do a math problem, you've got to remember the numbers that you're adding together, or that you're multiplying, or what have you. If you need to rearrange a set of words, those are a set of items, so it depends on your short-term memory. But you also need to manipulate the information. And this theory has evolved over time, but it's thought that there are multiple components to working memory. We're not going to go into huge detail here, but there is the visual spatial sketchpad, which is the part of your working memory that deals with visual information. So if you need to keep an image in mind and perhaps manipulate it in some way, think about what would happen if you changed the image, move things around. That's the visuospatial sketchpad. You also have the phonological loop, which is more auditory in nature. So when you have auditory information that you need to manipulate, or if you're keeping it in mind and rehearsing it over and over again, that depends on this part of your working memory. There's also the episodic buffer, which is a relatively new component of this model. I'm not going to go into detail on it, but it's thought that this is sort of a working memory component that deals with moving an information in and out of your immediate consciousness. That the information that's present is determined and held in this episodic buffer, and that your most recent experiences are held in this episodic buffer. There is the central executive, which is the part of working memory that determines what information is going to go in and out of working memory. How are we going to manipulate information? So it has a component of decision making. It has a component of attention. But it is what is in charge of your working memory, so to speak. Okay, and that brings us to long-term storage. So we've talked about sensory storage, short-term storage, which is often referred to as short-term memory, and then working memory. And now we get to long-term storage, otherwise known as long-term memory, or LTM. And this is what we more conventionally think of as our memory. So this is what holds information for hours up through years, your whole lifetime maybe. And so these are, when you're trying to remember something, it's your long-term memory that you're really trying to access. And long-term memory has no known capacity. As your book points out, you know thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of words, tens of thousands of facts. You can remember how lots and lots of objects look, how people look. You remember how everyone's faces look. You know lots of skills. So how do you perform certain actions? So think about all the thousands and thousands of things that you can remember. So there's no known capacity, no upper limit, on long-term storage that we know of. And in fact, there are There are individuals who have exceptional memories. And there are people that are in this group that have exceptional episodic memory. We'll learn about that in a minute. They can recall every day of their life, or at least every day after a certain point, perhaps. They have an almost perfect autobiographical record. There's someone you met at the beginning of your book chapter that fit that description. There are also people who have enormous memories for written material. So he died recently, but there was an individual named Kim Peek who was partially the inspiration for the character Rain Man from the 1988 movie Rain Man. And he could memorize vast amounts of information. He could remember entire books, and you could not just the content, not just the meaning or the plot, but if you actually quoted him a page number, he could recite that page. And of course, that requires a vast amount of memory storage as well. And so we really don't have an upper limit that we know of for our long-term memory. Now, of course, you can lose your long-term memory or components of it, so you can develop what is called amnesia. And amnesia we may be familiar with from movies or TV, and the way it's often portrayed in movies and TV is fairly different from how amnesia actually works. So you can have what is called retrograde amnesia, which is shown here in this diagram on the left. So if you often it's caused by surgery or an accident, some sort of trauma to the brain. And what happens is the individual cannot remember events before the injury. And often it is events shortly before the injury. And that's because due to the injury, information didn't have a chance to get from short-term memory into long-term memory. We'll talk about that in a minute. But retrograde amnesia can cover a wider span than that. It's not necessarily just the events right before the injury. It could be events in the person's life before that point. And that's retrograde amnesia. And again, TV, movies, these often portray individuals that have lost their memories. They don't know who they are. They don't remember anything for their entire life before the injury. And that is very rare. It's not clear that ever happens, for example. But you can have sort of a fading of memory, having fewer memories right before the accident or injury, and more memories before that. So those people often remember their early childhood, for example. They're seldom a total blank in terms of their life before the injury. You can also have what's called anterograde amnesia. So retro means backwards, antero means forwards, just like the word anterior. And anterograde amnesia is perhaps less famous, but probably more common in its extreme form at least. And that is where the individual cannot make new memories. They remember everything before the surgery or before the accident, but cannot remember anything that has happened afterwards. And so we're about to meet a patient, a very famous one, patient HM, who suffered from anterograde amnesia. He had a little bit of retrograde, but it was mostly anterograde. And so he could not form new memories. And what this form of amnesia suggests, especially if it's an injury to a particular part of the brain, is not that that part of the brain is required to store memories. If you destroyed the memory storage, then you wouldn't be able to retrieve them. You wouldn't remember your early childhood. But the fact that you can wipe out your capacity to remember things after the injury, but still retain memories before, suggests that anterograde amnesia results from a failure in storing memories. You can still retrieve the ones that are already there. You just can't store any new ones. And that brings us to the idea of consolidation. And consolidation is the process by which memories become stable. And more specifically, it's how we get memories, information, from short-term memory to long-term memory. So we have encoding, we have sensory storage, short-term storage, and then we have long-term storage. And so consolidation is how we get information into that long-term storage. And memories are really pretty fragile before consolidation. which is why if you suffer an injury, you often don't remember what happened right before it, because those memories are fragile when they're in short-term memory. Once they're consolidated into long-term memory, they're much more stable. They're less vulnerable to forgetting, for example. But before consolidation, before they move into long-term memory, they're very fragile. They're also vulnerable during what's called reconsolidation. So if you store a memory in long-term storage and then retrieve it, you remember the information, you have it in mind, uh, during that period, it's actually vulnerable again. So you have to reconsolidate information every time you bring it up. So you retrieve it, and you have to store it again. And while it's being retrieved, while it's in that retrieval state, while you're thinking about it, it's vulnerable to forgetting. As we'll see later, it's also vulnerable to modification, that we can experience an event, we remember it, perhaps we remember it clearly the first time. But then when we go back and think about it, when we're asked, we have to retrieve that information. And sometimes, while we're thinking about it, and as we store it a second time, it gets modified. So our memories can become less accurate the more we retrieve them. However, there is an upside here. And so certain long-term memories can be traumatic. If you've had a traumatic experience, that is often stored in long-term memory, and it can be intrusive. Sometimes that memory can come up and you don't want it to. We'll talk more about that in our next lecture. But the fact that memories are vulnerable during reconsolidation can be helpful. You can intentionally disrupt reconsolidation if it's something you don't want to remember. And there are therapies designed to treat traumatic memories that way. So in long-term storage, the question is, how does the brain store memories? How and where? So on the large scale, that is looking at the scale of the brain itself, uh, the most important part of the brain seems to be the hippocampus. Now, it's not the case that the hippocampus is important for all forms of memory. We'll talk about the different kinds in a bit. But the hippocampus is perhaps the most important structure for certain kinds of memory, and it's certainly the most heavily studied. So if we recall, the hippocampus is part of the limbic system, as are structures like the amygdala. And the hippocampus is located sort of on the underside of the temporal lobe. So you have the hippocampus both on your left and right sides of your brain. And they're located underneath the temporal lobe, on the very underside of the brain. And we know a lot of what we do about human memory thanks to a particular patient. That's patient HM. To protect their identities, patients are often referred to but just by their initials. We now know who patient HM is, or was. He died a few years ago. But he is perhaps the most famous patient in all of psychology, and he taught us an enormous amount about human memory. Now, patient HM's story is that he suffered from epilepsy. And so this epilepsy was not responding to medication, and the seizures were really bad and were getting more severe. And so they had to resort to surgery to try and remove those parts of the brain where the seizures were starting. That's how epilepsy works. Seizures will start in a particular location and then spread to the rest of the brain. And so one way surgically to address this is to remove the parts of the brain where the seizures tend to start. And so that's what they did with patient HM, and it was fairly successful. The seizures were certainly lessened, but they removed parts of both temporal lobes, and those parts included the hippocampus on both sides. And patient HM suffered from anterograde amnesia. His short-term memory was fine. He could remember things for a few seconds, up to a minute or more with rehearsal if he kept things in mind and repeated them to himself. But he could not form any new long-term memories. And so he was not aware of the passage of time since the surgery. He didn't know anything that had happened in his life since the surgery. He didn't know whether his parents were still alive, for example. And he didn't know the people that had worked with him for years, studying his memory, trying to help him. And so he would have to be reintroduced to researchers that had worked with him for a very long time because he couldn't store those long-term memories. Again, we'll see that not all forms of long-term memory depend on the hippocampus, and patient HM did retain certain forms of memory. So he could learn new skills, for example, but he could not remember what had happened the day before. That's on the large scale, on the scale of the whole brain. On the small scale, we know a bit about how memories are stored there as well. So there are definite synaptic changes. If we recall our unit on neurons, neurons join at what are called synapses. So you have the end of the axon for one neuron up against the dendrite of another neuron. And so there's this gap between the neurons, but they're very close together. And that location is where neurons communicate. And you may hear the adage, cells that fire together wire together. Now, your book makes it sound as though it just requires one synapse, that if one synapse is particularly active, that is the basis of memory. I don't like that description. I think it's a little misleading. So what happens, there is an active synapse involved. So one neuron is signaling another neuron. But that part of the phrase, cells that fire together, is really important. So here we have a diagram in the lower right, where we have some cells at the top that are synapses that are going to get strengthened. And cells at the bottom are going to get weakened. You can have it change both ways. You can have cell connections between synapses strengthen, that is, become more responsive. You can also have them become less responsive. The critical factor here is if neuron A fires, does neuron B, its neighbor, fire as well? Do they both send to action potentials? And so when it says cells that fire together, what that saying means is if neuron A fires and neuron B fires also, that the synapse between the two will get stronger. So the reason I don't like what your book says is that it sounds like if neuron A fires, that synapse will automatically get stronger. That's not true. Neuron A fires, but the neuron that's listening to it, neuron B, if it also fires, then that is the basis for strengthening that connection. Neuron B will start to listen to neuron A more, effectively speaking. So neuron A becomes a good predictor for whether neuron B is going to fire, and those synapses will become stronger. And what does that mean? Well, it means that if neuron A fires, neuron B is now more likely to fire if it's a stronger synapse. If it's a weak synapse, neuron A can fire and neuron B may ignore it. And so cells that fire together wire together. What it means is that the second neuron is listening to its neighbors and it changes synapses so that it fires when the reliable neighbors fire. So when it notices a correlation between its own firing and its neighbors, it listens to those neighbors more, so those neighbors that sort of agree with it. So that's what that saying means. Cells that fire together cause action potentials at the same time, wire together, strengthen their synapses. And the process that we think governs this is what's called long-term potentiation, often just called LTP. And we see here in this diagram, the lower left, two sort of lines. So the left part is before the cells fire together. And before that point, neuron B, the second neuron, has a certain response level. We can see here in the lower left. However, if they fire together a lot in a short period of time, now when neuron A fires, neuron B's response is bigger. And that's what we see here in this graph, is before they start firing together, it has a certain response level. After they start firing together, then it has a much higher response level. So this is the second neuron's response to neuron A. And we see this long-term potentiation. Potentiation means it responds more strongly. And long-term is just like long-term memory. It means it lasts for a while. So this can last for minutes, hours, days. And we think because the timescales match, and because it's a way for neurons to change their responses to store information, we think this is the basis for memory. All right, so we have encoding, which gets information into a format that can be stored. We have storage, which maintains information over time. We just saw that there are different forms of storage that correspond to different amounts of time. And then we have retrieval, which is the process of bringing that encoded and stored information to mind. So again, it wouldn't do as much good if we could store information, but then never access it again. And so retrieval is the act of bringing it back, into your mind. And retrieval is not a perfect process. It's not guaranteed. So there are different influences on retrieval. One of them is what's called the encoding specificity principle. And all that means is that the context in which you encode a memory influences your success at retrieving it. Your book gives a couple of examples, one of which is an experiment where they gave divers sets of words when they were on land and sets of words when they were underwater. And when they were asked to recall those words, if they were on land, when they were recalling them, or retrieving them, that is, they were better at retrieving the words they learned on the land. And when they were underwater, they were better at retrieving those words that they memorized when they were underwater. And so this is about the external context. If the external context, if the so-called cues that cause you to retrieve information, if they match, the environment matches the context in which you're trying to retrieve the information, you'll be much more successful. And so people will also tell you that if you want to do a little better on an exam, try to study in the same environment in which you'll take the exam. And now this may not be practical for a classroom setting. You can't always get into the classroom or you'll take the exam and study there. For an online course, however, it may be helpful to study in the same room that you'll eventually take the exam in. That way those contexts match. The environment in which you encoded the memories of facts will match the environments in which you're trying to retrieve them. There's also what's called state-dependent retrieval. And this is more internally focused. So the encoding specificity principle deals largely with external context. State-dependent retrieval is more about internal context. So if you're in a certain emotional state, it will be easier for you to recall information or events that you witnessed if you witnessed those things in a similar emotional state. Similarly, if you're perhaps under the influence of a drug or alcohol, that information that you learn in that context is easier to retrieve if you're back in that state again. So your internal state matters when it comes to retrieving information, whether it's an emotional state or some other physical state. Now, what does retrieval do for us? Well, obviously it brings the information to mind, but it does more than that. It can actually help us with things like exams, which is particularly relevant for our class here, but in general, retrieving information and then storing it again is more effective than just re-exposing yourself to the information, which is why practice testing is more effective than just rereading your book. The difference is that if you reread your book, you're getting the same sensory stimulus again, and you may store the memory again, but you're not recalling anything. That retrieval process is very important. And so if you're being tested, then you have to retrieve the information, and then you use it, and then you store it again. And we don't know exactly why, but that process seems to really help subsequent retrieval. That information is more accessible later if you stored it, retrieved it, and then stored it again, as opposed to just stored it, were exposed to it, and stored it again. So that retrieval component is important. You can also, however, get what's called retrieval-induced forgetting. And this is where if you store information and then you retrieve it, if you don't use everything you retrieve, the stuff you don't use is actually more likely to be forgotten than if you hadn't retrieved it at all. So the book described an experiment in which subjects read two lists. They memorized two lists of words. Uh, they were presented in pairs according to category. But the important part is that there are two kinds of words. There were words about fruit, and there were words about trees. And then the participants were asked to recall certain words on the fruit list. And they did so, but they weren't asked to retrieve all the words on the fruit list. And then later on, when they were asked to recall the words on the list, they could recall the tested words from the fruit list very easily. However, they had a better chance of forgetting those untested words. And what's really interesting is that the untested words were actually forgotten more than words on the list that weren't asked about at all. And so the idea is that these words were competing. If they were brought to mind, the whole list of fruit was brought to mind. Only certain members of the list were used. The others were suppressed. And so then when consolidation happened again, that only the used words got reconsolidated. And the tree list, which wasn't asked about at all, had been stored that one time and could be retrieved, but it never experienced any suppression like that. So that is retrieval-induced forgetting. The idea that retrieving, as long as you use the information, can help you store the information and access it better the next time. But if you retrieve it and then don't use it, it may actually be worse than not retrieving it at all. As for the brain, so what happens when we try to retrieve information? So if we're successful, this often involves the hippocampus, which again is a part of the brain we looked at just a minute ago, especially with regard to patient HM. And the hippocampus, again, is not critical for all forms of memory, but if you're trying to recall information, it's often something that's happened, an experience. And if you're successful, then you see activity in the hippocampus. If you're not successful, then you see activity in the lower part of the frontal lobe. And so that difference in activity seems to correspond to whether you're able to retrieve the information or whether you just try to access it over and over again but fail to actually retrieve it. So we do see differences in the brain in terms of retrieving success and retrieving failure. Okay, so when it comes to long-term memory, there are actually different kinds. And so we know that there are different forms of storage, and long-term memory is just one of them. But there are also different kinds of long-term memory itself. And one big category is what's called explicit memory. This is sometimes called declarative memory. And these are memories that are retrieved consciously and intentionally. So when you try to remember something, it's your explicit memory that you're using. So one type of explicit memory is semantic memory. So we already talked about semantic encoding, where you take in information in the form of meaning or significance. Semantic memory is partially about the meanings of words and things like that, but it's mainly about facts. So something that you haven't directly witnessed, but you studied or you learned in some way that is fact-based. It is a statement that you can articulate. That's why it's often called declarative memory instead of explicit memory, because these are things that you can describe, you can state them, you can declare them. Anyway, so semantic memory is fact-based memory. The other form of explicit memory is episodic memory, and this is autobiographical. These are things in your life that you've experienced. So you can describe these as well, but this seems to be a fundamentally different kind of memory than semantic memory. Your life experiences are not just a list of facts that you've memorized. And again, you can memorize facts without actually having witnessed what they describe. So this diagram here in the bottom right is a set of areas that becomes active when you try to remember past life, your experiences in your life, but also if you try to imagine your future. And so we can see a number of areas: the frontal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe. Um, so this is a lot of real estate. But most importantly, uh, you'll see the medial temporal lobe in this diagram. And that is a section of the brain that includes the hippocampus. So the hippocampus turns out to be crucial for episodic memory. And patient HM lost both hippocampi, could not store any new episodic memories. He couldn't remember what had happened in his life after the surgery. The hippocampus is not where these memories are stored. So he could still remember things that happened before the surgery. If the hippocampus had been removed and that's where those memories were stored, he wouldn't be able to retrieve them. The fact that he could retrieve them means that the hippocampus is important for storing those memories, but it is not the actual location where they are stored, which has led psychologists to think that the hippocampus is sort of an index. It's a part of the brain that allows you to look up where information is stored and then go and access it. It's also worth noting that the hippocampus is important for episodic memory, but not, it turns out, for semantic memory. You can have hippocampal damage and still learn new facts. The other big category is implicit memory. And these are forms of information or memories where experience influences later behavior. But these are not memories of those experiences themselves. So this is how it's different from episodic memory. Something you've gone through changes your later behavior, but the memory that we're talking about here is not your memory of whatever experience that was. So I'll go into that. And the thing is here that this happens even without awareness or effort. So that's how it's different from explicit memory, which again is conscious and intentional. So procedural memory, which often refers to skills. So you learn how to ride a bike, for example. You learn how to text, for example, how to use your arms to accomplish certain tasks or use your hands. And these are things that you can get better at over time. But you can't really describe how you got better at them. It's hard to describe how to ride a bike. And when you start riding it, you obviously improve. But what accounts for that difference? How would you describe the initial skill set of riding a bike, and how would you describe it later? It's very hard to articulate. So this, again, is not a memory. It's not an experience that you can retrieve and then describe. So procedural memory is often about acquired skills. There's also what is called priming. And priming is where exposure to a stimulus makes you more likely to say something related to that stimulus later. So things like subliminal messaging are often cited as forms of priming, where you have a sensory stimulus that you see, perhaps even without your awareness, but it influences your later behavior. So for example, if you're given a list of words, here's a list right here in the lower left. And then later on, you're given the first part of a word and a couple of blanks where you can fill in whatever letters you want. If you have seen a word on the list like stamp, and then you're given STA blank blank, you're far more likely to fill in the word stamp if you've been exposed to that list. If you haven't been exposed to the list, you could say start, or stars, or stall, or any number of other words that begin with STA. And so being exposed to this list, even if you weren't told to explicitly memorize it, it may have even been flashed too quick for you to be consciously aware of it. And yet it will still influence what words you write down when you're prompted with STA blank blank. And so that's what priming is, where exposure to a stimulus, even if you're not aware of it or can't recall that experience, influences later behavior. And this works on individuals even if they have hippocampal damage. So it doesn't depend on episodic memory. They don't have to be able to recall the experience of seeing this list. They can still be primed. They will still exhibit this behavior. And your book doesn't mention this, but conditioning is also a form of implicit memory. So it's where your experience, in this case, the experience of the pairing of the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, if it's classical conditioning, uh, that is a form of learning, and it uses memory. So your later behavior changes. You start exhibiting the conditioned response. Uh, and again, this does not require intention. It does not require for the person to remember the experience of being conditioned. They will still exhibit classical conditioning. Okay, that will do it for this lecture. Uh, Next lecture, we will continue our unit on memory, and we'll talk about what your book calls the 7 sins of memory, which are different errors that we can make when we try to store memories or retrieve memories later. So we'll talk about what kind of errors we tend to make. How is our memory not perfect? What mistakes are made? And why do we make those particular mistakes? Now, sometimes the answer to that question is because those sorts of mistakes are helpful in certain ways. But they may seem inconvenient sometimes, but most of the time it's a good thing that we have this particular feature of our memory. Sometimes it's just that our brains are limited in their capacity, especially when it comes to things like attention. And then we'll also look at influences on our storage and retrieval of memories. So what causes these errors? What contexts are these errors more likely in? So we will cover all of that next time, and I will see you then.